Chapter 40. Mazen. Mazen woke in what looked like the ruins of a prison cell. Moonlight filtered into the chamber through holes in the ceiling, illuminating the dust on the floor and turning it an ominous bone white. The cell was bare and surrounded by 3 walls of stone and one made of thick iron bars. Behind them stood Imad, and beside him a ghoul. Sabah al-Khair, Prince. What? Mazen sat up slowly. He'd expected to be bound and gagged, but there were no shackles on his arms or legs. Sleep well? Ahmed raised a brow. Mazen blinked. He opened his mouth and froze when his memories came rushing back. He remembered Kadir dead, Luli screaming his name, Aisha bleeding out in the sand. He approached the bars, heart beating in his throat. What have you done with Aisha? The last thing he remembered was shaking her, begging her to hold on. Hold on. She was one of Omar's 40 thieves, and how could she be killed by some random murderer? And then pain. And darkness. Bint Luwas is in one piece, Imad said. Injured, but alive. She is lucky. I ought to have punished her more severely. He reached out and curled his fingers around one of the bars, and Mazen saw the bloody wounds Aisha had ripped into his bandages. He took a cautious step back. What do you want from us? Imad's lips quirked. Truly, I never wanted anything from you. But now that you are here, it seems I must change my plans. He leaned closer to the bars, close enough for Mazen to make out the details of his face in the moonlight. He was at least as old as the Sultan, with harsh wrinkles etched into his sun-scorched skin, and gray-white hair dusting his cheeks and chin. Do not underestimate a man based on his appearance. It was the advice his father offered when they were dealing with scheming court politicians. Iman was an old blade, but not a dull one. Mazen paused, recalling their earlier conversation. You were looking for my brother. That is correct. The moment I heard Omar bin Malik was leading the Midnight Merchant in this direction, I decided to investigate, and yet... He raised a pointed brow. It is not the High Prince I see before me, but his younger brother. How did this come to be? Idiot that I am, allowed myself to be blackmailed. Mazen swallowed a laugh. He truly was a fool. To have thought his tramp through the desert was preferable to suffering the consequences for escaping the palace. To have thought it would be an adventure. It was advantageous for my brother and me to switch places. Is that so? It hardly seems so now, does it? Mazen couldn't decide if he wanted to punch himself or Imad more. No, he said softly, it doesn't. He looked long and hard at the man, then said, Why chase rumors of my brother in the first place? What do you want with him? Imad's expression hardened. You mean to tell me you do not know who I am? I don't think we'd be having this conversation if I did. Imad hissed. At first Mazen thought it was a response meant for him, but then he noticed the ghoul behind Imad shift. It handed him a keyring. How are you... Mazen looked between Imad and the ghoul. How are you controlling them? In his mother's stories, the ghouls were free-roaming terrors, not obedient soldiers. Imad raised a brow. I shall let you ponder. It will give you something to think about while we wait for your brother. The reality of his situation began to sink in. Mazen combed desperately through his memories, trying to recall Imad's words. If he knew both Omar and Aisha. Are you a thief? I am not just a thief, boy. I am one of the legendary 40 thieves. Imad stepped forward, black eyes narrowed to slits. Once I even worked with the Sultan. Mazen balked. So Imad was not one of Omar's thieves, he was one of his father's. But how? His father had proclaimed his thieves had died in some tragic incident long ago when Omar first took over as king of the 40 thieves. If you were one of my father's thieves, why are you holding a grudge against Omar? Imad smiled thinly. This is between us and does not concern you. Your only job, Prince, is to sit here and wait while I send the ransom note. He crossed his arms and leaned against the wall. However, though you are my prisoner, you need not be treated like one. Tell me one thing, and I shall make you comfortable until his arrival. Mazen eyed him warily. What? Imad reached into his pocket. Mazen expected him to withdraw a weapon. Instead, he pulled out the bangle. He clasped it to his wrist, and a heartbeat later he wore Omar's skin. Mazen gaped at him as he flexed his fingers, which were no longer malformed. Truly remarkable. He looked at Mazen. I am familiar with your family's story and already know this is a Jinn King's relic, but I want to know, does your brother possess other king's relics? Mazen hesitated. Why does it matter? He wanted to ask, but he knew Imad would not answer. When he remained mute, the thief sighed and said, I don't know who you think you're protecting, but know this. You may idolize your brother. Mazen nearly laughed aloud. But he is not a good man. Whatever he did to convince you to take his place, he did it because he has ulterior motives. Mazen frowned. There was a connection between the king's relics and Omar's ulterior motives. He was sure, but he refused to dig deep enough to find it. Omar was insufferable, but he was still his brother. He would have to be insane to trust a killer over him. Ask my brother your questions, Mazen said. This is none of my business, after all. He didn't know where he dredged up the courage to say the words, but he was evidently more surprised than Imad, who simply stepped away with a shrug. You are lucky I need you alive, Prince. But remember, any discomfort you, his eyes flashed, or your companions experience is your fault. All that came out of Mazen's mouth was a weak sound of protest. Imad ignored him. He spoke a word of command to the ghoul, who obediently stepped in front of Mazen's cell door and a sword in its hands. Try not to irritate the guard. Imad turned and walked away. Wait! Mazen grasped the bars. Don't hurt Aisha or the merchant, please. But Imad never even looked back. Mazen called his name again, but the only response he received was his own voice echoing back at him from the dreary infiniteness of the corridor. Belatedly he realized the ghoul was staring at him. He took one look at its ghastly, torn-up face and doubled back until he was pressed against the wall. Breathe, he commanded himself, and he did, slowly, in and out. He suppressed the wild urge to scream at the walls. He could not stay here, that much was apparent. Also apparent was the impossibility of escaping. He had no weapon, no plan. His eyes drifted across his cell. The holes in the ceiling were too high for him to reach. As for the ghoul, even if he could somehow coax it into his cell, he had no weapon to face it. And even with one, he was useless. His only talents included sneaking, running, hiding. He stopped and stared at his shadow on the floor. Oh! He scraped at the silhouette. Relief crashed through his veins when it curled beneath his fingers. Imad may be able to take my knives, but he could never steal my shadow. The ghoul whirled, sniffing at the air. Too late, Mazen remembered it could smell magic. When the ghoul faced him, Mazen had the shadow, now very much a magical relic, clenched in his fingers. The ghoul stared. Mazen stared back. He thought of Aisha's crimson blood on the sand and Kadir's silver blood on the swords, and he came to a decision. His relief sharpened into determination. If no one is coming to help me, I have no choice but to save myself. Ah! He held the shadow up with a dramatic gasp. What manner of magic is this? The ghoul shoved the key into the door and stepped into the prison with unbalanced, frantic steps. It snarled and reached out a bony hand. Mazen gathered his courage and kicked it as it kneeled before him. The creature stumbled back, but not before swiping the blade across his arm, drawing blood. Mazen tried to steal the ghoul's blade. He grabbed for the hilt. The ghoul drove an elbow into his chest and knocked the air from his lungs. Mazen retaliated by shoving his full weight into the ghoul's side, or at least he tried to, but he lost his footing and fell on the creature instead. They collapsed to the ground in a heap. There was a moment of panic as Mazen rushed to untangle his limbs from the ghoul's. He choked back tears as the pungent smell of its rotting body invaded his senses, and just barely managed to gather himself before the ghoul struck at him again. The blade nicked his arm, but this time he managed to grasp the hilt. He and the ghoul wrestled the blade back and forth. Finally, Mazen pried the weapon from its cold hands. Panic gave him the courage to swing the blade and the strength to drive it into the creature's chest, over and over and over again until it was a sinewy mess of gore and muscle. Mazen nudged the remains with a foot. When the corpse didn't move, he smiled, laughed, and then promptly vomited his guts out in a corner of the room. He was trembling as he swiped the hand across his mouth. His every instinct screamed at him to escape, but he shoved that urge aside. Luli and Aisha had saved his life. He refused to leave without them. It didn't matter that he was a coward. Cowards knew how to flee and hide, and that was good enough. Mazen threw his shadow over his head and snuck out of his prison.